Good afternoon, and welcome to Indiana University's Equality Day Keynote Address. Anita Morgan's talk and her Q&A session are central to our Women's Equality Day series. We are so glad you're here to join us as we commemorate 100 years and the 100th anniversary of women gaining the legal right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And today we get to hear stories about how our own Hoosier state of Indiana made that journey. I'm Lisa Marie Napoli, Director of the IU's Political and Civic Engagement Program. We're housed in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I am honored to be here with you today and deeply thankful to all of the collaborators working together to make IU's Equality Day series happen this week. I want to acknowledge the outstanding collaborative work of our co-sponsors, the IU Arts and Humanities Council. Give a big shout out to them for so much support. And also equally supportive, Office of the Provost and Executive Vice President, the Themester 2020 Democracy, and the Department of History, as well as PACE. Additional support for our keynote address comes from the Department of Political Science and the Department of Gender Studies. Finally, it's important to acknowledge, as always, our sense of place, where we are, and to honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people on whose ancestral homelands IU was built. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Morgan earned her BS, MS, MA, and finally, her PhD in U.S. history from Purdue University. She has taught at Purdue University, IUPUI, IUPUC, and Texas A&M Corpus Christi. She is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of History at IUPUI and is a past president of the Indiana Association of Historians. She recently co-edited with Nancy Gabin of Purdue University an issue of the Indiana Magazine of History devoted to the study of Indiana women's history. She is also one of the co-founders of the Hoosier Women at Work Conference. Her past research includes research includes a look at women business owners and women who worked in the Indiana State Arsenal during the Civil War. Her book, We Must Be Fearless, The Woman Suffrage Movement in Indiana, was published in March 2020 by the Indiana Historical Society Press. It's an honor to introduce to you Dr. Anita Morgan.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I feel like I went to school for a really long time, hearing all those degrees in a row. Greetings, everyone. It's Women's Equality Day. Yay. I thought we'd first just remember why it is we're celebrating today. It's on this day after several last-minute attempts by the Tennessee legislature to walk back their ratification of the 19th Amendment, that their ratification was delivered to the U.S. Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby. It was delivered in the early hours, wee hours of the morning of August 26th, and he signed it immediately with no fanfare. Later in the day, Carrie Chapman Catt, Maud Wood Park, and Harriet Taylor Upton of the National American Woman Suffrage Association went to his office for a quick meeting and a little what they called celebration of the event. After they were gone, delegates from the National Woman's Party arrived at his office for the same sort of celebration, but they were not received due to what was called a diplomatic emergency, but was more than likely an intentional snub at the Women's Party because this is a group that had sponsored the picketing at the White House. In spite of that, in other words, after Colby's signature, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was official and women could vote. And that's a very simplistic way of saying that. And we'll get into the complexities of what that means a little bit later in the talk. Legal challenges to the 19th Amendment continued through 1922, but were turned back. Now, what had happened in Indiana prior to the Women's Equality Day in August? In Indiana, the vote was much simpler than it had been in Tennessee. After Indiana suffragists worked very hard, there was an overwhelming vote in favor of ratification by the state's General Assembly on January 16th, 1920. Only 3 members of the General Assembly voted against it. The whole process took only 2 to 3 hours. It was very well staged, laid out, planned, and was followed by literal dancing in the halls of the State House, as the suffragists had thought to invite a band with them so they could celebrate after the ratification. Even Cora Goodrich, a staunch suffragist who also happened to be the governor's wife, joined in the festivities and was seen waltzing in the hallways of the State House. Then after their celebration, suffragists got to work and held suffrage schools across the state so that women would feel more comfortable at the polls in November, because they were confident that the amendment would be ratified. I've been talking about my research on suffrage for well over a year now, and I'm always struck by the fact that so few people are acquainted with the women who led the suffrage movement in Indiana. So for the rest of my talk today, I want to look at pairs of Hoosier suffragists whose work spanned the decades of the woman suffrage movement to see what they can tell us about women's work to win the vote in Indiana. And then after I finish that, we'll jump immediately back into the ratification of the 19th Amendment and look at what happened with voter registration and with voting in 1920 among women in Indiana. This is one of my favorite slides. This is actually from 1916. This is in Tomlinson Hall in Indianapolis. And I have cropped out presidential candidate Charles Evans Hughes from the right side of the screen. This was a big rally to support his campaign. But what I want to focus on is what's going on in the balcony up there. And you can see it's filled with suffragists. And they were not sitting in the balcony because they were shunned aside. They were sitting in the balcony because they wanted to sit in the balcony. You'll notice they have the big banner off to the left that has the wording of the 19th Amendment on it. And they had just finished a very long, miles-long parade through the streets of Indianapolis with 3 suffragists carrying that banner. And then when they got to Tomlinson Hall, they made a big splash as they entered and made sure that they draped it over the balcony so that everyone could see. And in recognition of their entrance, the presidential candidate actually stood with his wife and acknowledged the women in the balcony. And like I said, I include that mostly so you can see the wording and because it's one of my favorite photos. Can we do the next slide, please? Thank you. The first 2 women I want to talk about are Amanda Way and Dr. Mary Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the woman with her hands folded in front of her. Let's talk about first the similarities of these women. Both were Quakers who later became Methodists. Both were abolitionist and temperance advocates, as were most of the early Hoosier suffragists. Both had been teachers who had left the field so that they could make enough money to support themselves. Dr. Thomas in particular was upset when she discovered that a man teacher made more money than she did. Both women supported this union in the Civil War in a medical field. Way served as a nurse and Thomas as a doctor. Both worked on transport ships which carried wounded Union soldiers up the Mississippi River and back to Indiana. Amanda Way was the one who at the age of 23 took the opportunity at an Indiana abolitionist convention to call for a women's rights meeting. Dr. Thomas was a bit older, her early 30s, which is probably about the age she was in this photo, married with 3 children, and she was getting ready to attend medical school in Pennsylvania. Way chaired the first meeting and Thomas could not attend and just sent a note of encouragement. After the Civil War, Way left for Kansas where much of her family lived, and temperance became mostly her main concern, although she never really dropped suffrage. Thomas stayed in Indiana, and it's safe to say that for the first 30 years, she was the driving force behind the suffrage movement. She made sure the movement maintained its momentum through its annual meetings, and also at the national level was president for 1 year of the American Woman Suffrage Association, one of the 2 national associations. She eventually stopped her work in the movement due to her age. Nothing else stopped her. She died in August 1888, 3 days after making a midnight house call at the age of 72. The pallbearers at her funeral, all women, represented her life's work and also the major pillars of the Indiana women's rights movement. One pallbearer represented suffrage, two represented the temperance movement, one represented the Home for Friendless Women, and two African-American women, Mrs. Kizzy Johnson and Mrs. M.A. Mason, represented both the abolitionist movement and Thomas's medical work amongst the Black community in Richmond. When we look at these women of our earliest movement, we can see there's similarities with many national suffrage leaders. This is also the way that many national suffrage leaders got involved through abolition and through temperance. If we could have the next slide then. Okay. May Wright, Sewall, and Helen Gougar, and their names are over their photos. I often find it hard to talk about these two women, not because they don't deserve recognition, they do, but when you work with women enough in this way, you start to have feelings about them, and I have feelings about these two. Some good, some bad. So let's see what they did. Gougar and Sewall actually had much in common. They were born 1 year apart, and they started their careers as teachers, so we see that teacher theme again. Gougar taught for a short time in Lafayette. Sewall taught in Wisconsin and Michigan, served as the principal of the Franklin, Indiana High School, and then moved to Indianapolis High School, which will later become Shortridge, and she taught German and English there. Both women also had strong working relationships with their husbands. Gougar's husband was a lawyer, and he had some kind of medical condition with his eyes. So she often read his legal papers to him and became so well acquainted with the law that she was eventually admitted to the bar. Sewall's first husband taught with her in Franklin and Indianapolis before dying of tuberculosis. Her second husband operated a private boys' school, the Indianapolis Classical School, and she taught there with him before she opened her own private girls' school. Neither couple had any children. Gougar and Sewall both wrote for their local newspapers. The Indianapolis Times supported woman suffrage, and Sewall's column, called Woman's Work, appeared in its pages from 1881 to 1885. Her column topics included suffrage, equal pay for equal work, which some of you will remember was one of the first resolutions passed at the 1851 meeting for the Women's Rights Association, and women's access to higher education. Gougar wrote a column for the Lafayette Daily Courier from 1878 to 1880, and then she eventually branched out into owning her own newspaper, which was called Our Herald, which was short-lived and rather intense in its content. They both belonged to the Indiana Woman Suffrage Association. For all they had in common, their approaches to suffrage were very different, and the two of them often did not get along because of these two different approaches. Gougar embraced the Women's Christian Temperance Union and third-party politics. She lectured for the Populist Party with Mary Lease, famed orator of the party, and she would embrace any party. Sometimes it was Democrat, sometimes it was Republican, sometimes it was just a local party that had sprung up, if she thought that that party would help her cause. Gougar led women from all across the state in an attempt to vote in 1894, and herself sued Tippecanoe County officials when she was denied that right. And by the way, that was all arranged. The Tippecanoe County officials had agreed to deny her the vote so that she could then pursue this case in court. She argued her case before the state Supreme Court to no avail, and she lost the case. Sewall, on the other hand, agreed with the National American Woman Suffrage Association that prohibition or temperance would be good to achieve, but the vote was the more pressing concern, since all other reforms might be more easily achieved once the vote was in place. Therefore, Sewall did not embrace party politics or temperance work, and instead used her considerable organizing skills to organize women on a massive scale. Sewall was one of, if not the major driving force behind the creation of the National Council of Women and the International Council of Women. She does not get the credit she deserves for that work, or for inadvertently, by forming the National Council of Women, for paving the way for the creation, both in Indiana and the nation, of one of the largest training grounds for future suffragists, the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Women who were not quite ready to embrace suffrage but wanted an outlet for their intellectual and creative endeavors joined women's clubs. The clubs then slowly moved into community reform. such as placing libraries in your town, in your county, in your local schools, art and music classes being placed in local public schools. And they were also, the General Federation was one of the moving forces behind the creation of the state park system that we still have today. By doing all these activities, they learned the ins and outs of the legislative process and learned how to deal with politicians. But they soon realized that their goals would be more easily achieved if, instead of approaching legislators as petitioners, saying, please do this for us, they approached them as voters. While both women, both Gougar and Sewall, had national and international reputations, the suffrage movement in Indiana did not make much great progress during their time of their most intense activity. But both Black and white women's clubs, as in the General Federation of Clubs, trained the next generation of suffragists while they were busy with their own activities. And I could talk all day on both of them, but I won't. So could we go on to the next slide? Okay, Dr. Amelia Keller and Dr. Hannah Graham. Again, these are two suffragists who had distinct skill sets, if you will. Dr. Keller was very politically savvy, and Dr. Graham, who you see here standing behind the table, was very good with grassroots activism. And this slide reminds me that I should have mentioned earlier, some of the photos in this slide are not the best, but that's because most of the kind of action photos, like Dr. Graham here, were taken from the Indianapolis newspapers, the Indianapolis News and the Indianapolis Star. There were two newspapers, well, three, and the Indianapolis Times at this time. Unfortunately, when myself and the Indiana Historical Society approached the Indianapolis Star about having negatives of some of these great photos, we were told that unfortunately there were only 5 suffrage photos that existed still in their archives. And so I want to give much credit to the Indiana Historical Society for being able to, and actually also some people at the Indiana Historical Bureau, for being able to get as good of photos as we have from the digital records. Okay, back to Dr. Keller and Dr. Graham. Both were physicians, as you might have guessed. Dr. Keller was the first woman faculty member at the IU Medical School in Indianapolis and frequently devoted her practice to women and children. Dr. Graham focused on abdominal surgery, and in her spare time, she also obtained a law degree. Both were also daughters of immigrants. Dr. Keller's parents were German immigrants, and her father published German language newspapers in Ohio and Indiana. Dr. Graham's father was an English stonemason, and her mother was an Irish woman who had worked as a seamstress and as a domestic servant. The Grahams were Catholics, and Keller doesn't seem to have had any strong religious affiliation one way or the other. Keller and Graham did not always get along with each other, and that friction probably stemmed from their different emphases on the way to get the vote. Dr. Graham, who was president of the Indianapolis branch of the Equal Suffrage Association, one of Indiana's 2 big suffrage associations. Dr. Graham was better at grassroots activism. She was the first to reach out to labor of the 2 big organizations. She was the first to reach out to socialists of the 2 big organizations, and also to African Americans. The public announcement of branch number 7, the first African American suffrage club in Indianapolis, met with a sharp and decidedly negative response from at least one person. Dr. Graham received a letter from a supposed woman suffrage advocate who declared that she would pull her support if the plan to form branch number 7 went through, stating, and these are her words, not mine, "You will find that this move to secure more numbers by bringing in a Negro contingent will deter hundreds of self-respecting white women from supporting the cause and will disgust many that are already active in it." Graham had a sharp response. "Is the suffrage movement to be placed on the pink tea basis? The suffrage movement is not a stepping stone to social distinction. It is a stepping stone to political emancipation." And of course, we know about this because Dr. Graham was so incensed, she made sure that the insulting letter and her very sharp response were given to the press and published in the local newspapers. Excuse me for a moment. Keller's considerable skills, on the other hand, were on display when she lobbied and worked within the political system. She distributed suffrage literature at the polls, talked to men at local political meetings, easily talked with legislators in the halls of the State House, and was very comfortable working within the established political system. After she saw the wisdom, though, of Graham's work with grassroots groups, Keller steered the Women's Franchise League, which was the other big women's suffrage group, in the same direction. And with the unexplained disappearance of Graham's Indianapolis ESA branch, we're not quite sure what happened, but they seem to just kind of fade away. After that happened, the Women's Franchise League launched several new Black women's suffrage clubs, both in Indianapolis and in Muncie. Keller and Graham cooperated with each other on the march to the State House in 1913, but they could never quite find a way to work together on a consistent basis. The ESA and the WFL never merged, in spite of some serious arm twisting from the National American Woman Suffrage Association, also known as NAWSA. NAWSA President Carrie Chapman Catt saw the benefits of merging the two groups, whose leaders had different skill sets, but the women resisted. Mary Garrett Hay, Catt's partner and a Hoosier native, also tried to mediate between the two groups, but to no avail. Keller and Graham reconnected the Indiana suffrage movement with the state's Black women's activists, who they had never really forgotten. They pop up periodically, but the suffrage movement as a whole had not reached out to those activists, it appears, in a meaningful way for some time. So they start this reconnecting with people from, as the newspapers always called it, all walks of life. Okay, if we could have the next one then. Okay. The next two women I'm going to talk about, I didn't have good enough pictures of Frances Berry Costin to have the side-by-side like I did for the others. So I'm going to have a series of three photos here. I'll explain why in a minute, but as you look at it, you'll notice that there's a big banner that says Indiana across the bottom of this picture. And Carrie Barnes Ross, who's actually in this picture, and Frances Berry Costin are just two examples of the many Black women who were involved in the Hoosier suffrage movement. The first public mention of African American women's involvement in the women's suffrage movement in Indiana is found in the 1869 Indiana Women's Rights Association meeting, which was the first meeting after the Civil War. And it was a huge meeting. Hundreds of both men and women, former Union officers, politicians, ministers, everyone was at this meeting. A Black woman in attendance wanted to know if Black women were included in the movement, and the answer was yes. It is quite possible African American women attended suffrage meetings before 1869, since Dr. Thomas came from a staunchly abolitionist family and had participated in Indiana's abolitionist efforts. So the presence of known abolitionists who had close ties to Black women would make it maybe not remarkable to find their presence at the meetings. Black women were again present at the Indiana Woman Suffrage Association meeting in 1882. Zerelda Wallace made sure that hundreds of the women in attendance knew that the Black women were going to be allowed to deliberate and participate in the proceedings. In 1916, Black suffragist Carrie Wallen of Irvington, Lizzie Compton, and Minnie Highbaugh of Indianapolis heard Carrie Chapman Catt speak at a very large suffrage meeting in Indianapolis. Again, it was one of those joint meetings with the ESA and the WFL, and they attended as well. Finally, a speech by Estella Weaver Nukes of Marion, and a descendant of the Weaver settlement, which was a free Black community that had been established outside of Marion, had a slot on the agenda at the 1917 State Women's Franchise League meeting. She was asked to speak on the formation of how to form more African American women's suffrage clubs in the state. And she suggested that women look to the ministers of Black churches to help organize such clubs across the state. And indeed, the records that we have, that we do have for Black women's suffrage clubs, you'll often find that their meetings are at a variety of Protestant denominations, local Black churches. This kind of cooperation back and forth between Black suffrage clubs and white did not take place throughout the country. In Kentucky, for example, Black women's suffrage clubs were present, but they did not intersect or interact with the white women's club. Whereas if you look at Indiana and if you look at some places in Ohio, then you'll see interaction between the two. So let's look more closely at the two women who guided the Indianapolis Black Women's Suffrage Movement, and they are involved heavily, Carrie Barnes Ross and Frances Berry Costin. Both were born in Kentucky. Costin attended Berea College and was part of the last class of African Americans to graduate from there before it became a segregated school. It's an interesting school. It starts integrated, becomes segregated, and then it will become integrated again. Ross attended Columbia's Teacher College and taught at Tuskegee for a time. Both taught in the segregated elementary schools in Indianapolis. Both were in demand as speakers for public events, usually related to school, church, or civic programs that were going on in the Indianapolis Black community. Both attended events at IU Bloomington. In 1910, Costin visited IU Bloomington to speak at the Du Bois Club, a club for Black IU students. She gave a short talk entitled The Short Story and Its Place in Modern Fiction, and then she told a short story of her own. This Du Bois Club, and thanks to Dina Kellums at the IU Bloomington Archives for help with this, this Du Bois Club that she spoke at is probably the original version of the one that existed at IU Bloomington in the 1960s, and they had a little dust up with the administration over a speaker. So I think this is the same group. This photo is from 1911, and this is Carrie Barnes attending a house party at Kappa Alpha Psi. And Carrie Barnes is in the front row, seated behind the D, with a child in her lap. The child is not hers as far as we know. As far as we know, she only had one child. Her family has never mentioned that she had another one. So I think this must have been someone else's child. Okay, could we have the next slide? Okay, and this is a better photo of Carrie Barnes Ross, which was supplied to me by her granddaughter, Susan Ross. And if you've been paying attention to any of the Historical Society events that have been going on, this photo should look fairly familiar. Ross and Costin approached suffrage a little differently. Ross led a suffrage organization, branch number 7 of the Equal Suffrage Association, which is the group that Dr. Graham had organized. The first meeting was at Madam C.J. Walker's home. Ross also spoke at a meeting of labor unionists and socialists on the importance of women getting the vote, where she was the only woman speaker aside from Dr. Graham, and these were very large meetings. Ross's extensive work for suffrage in Indiana was cut short, unfortunately, when she married a Boston dentist and moved to Massachusetts. Once she was there, her granddaughter states that she was involved with the NAACP. In 1918, Ross will tragically die 6 weeks after giving birth to her only child. There was some sort of medical complications. It's not entirely clear. Madam Walker was a friend of the family. She went out east to see what she could do. And her letters state that some sort of surgery was involved, but it's not entirely clear what happened. And so 6 weeks after giving birth, Carrie Barnes Ross will die. Her child, Hubert Barnes Ross, later entered Yale University as a graduate student in sociology, switched to anthropology, and then finally received his PhD in 1954 from Columbia University. And again, I want to thank Susan Ross of Atlanta for supplying us with the information on her grandmother. If we could have the next slide. The other person that I want to mention is Frances Berry Costin. This is a photo from Berea College. She is in the second row, the dark shirt with the white spots on it. And in the back row, the two gentlemen in the back are her brothers. Costin involvement in the suffrage movement can be seen most easily from her newspaper articles that were published in the Indianapolis News. She wrote mostly about education and politics before the 1920 vote. She lectured Black suffragists on the importance of reaching out in the Black community to those who did not know about the fight for the vote. While she thought that studying the state constitution and state and national offices at suffrage meetings was necessary and important, it would do no good if the largest number of Black women possible did not get out and vote. In another article, she stressed that the Indianapolis Black community, both men and women, should vote for the candidate who would do the most good for the community. Instead of following a traditional default to Republican candidates, as might have been expected, she thought that women and men should closely study their options. Unlike Ross, who left Indianapolis, Costin stayed in Indianapolis, worked with Flanner House, with Settlement House, helped to organize the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, continued to teach, and was a staff writer for the Indianapolis News. She also did extensive work for what at the time was called the Colored Orphans Home. And again, I've had help with this research from Costin's great-granddaughter, who I happened to meet on Twitter, which was really interesting. These are just two of the many Black suffragists in the state, and there's so much more work that remains to be done. So this is a topic that really needs to be picked up. Finally, the last pair of women, if we could have that next slide, please. Thank you. Luella McWhirter and Sara Messing Stern, probably two of my favorite women ever. I'm only going to say a short thing about them, but because I am talking at IU, I want to encourage you to go out and find out more yourself about both of these women. The Lilly Library at IU Bloomington holds a large collection of Luella McWhirter's papers, both her work in suffrage and her work with the Women's Christian Temperance Union is in that collection. The other nice thing that's in that collection are some very chatty, very lovely, both business and family oriented letters to McWhirter from Stern. So if you're looking for a research project, I don't know how you can get into the library right now given current restrictions, but there's a lot of really wonderful information there. Luella McWhirter and Sara Messing Stern were childhood friends in Indianapolis. McWhirter's grandfather, Hezekiah Smith Sr., was one of the original settlers of the capital city and a Methodist circuit rider. Her father was also a Methodist minister. Stern's father, Meyer Messing, was the longest serving rabbi in Indianapolis to that time. How they met in what was still kind of not a big but not a small town is unknown, perhaps at school, but it's readily apparent from Stern's letters to McWhirter's that they were very good friends and knew each other's families well. And in fact, I've seen in a newspaper column where Stern is talking about McWhirter, she calls her very dear childhood friend. Excuse me. I'm including them both here because they were heavily involved with suffrage organizations in that final push to 1920. McWhirter led the Legislative Council. McWhirter is another one of those women who's a mastered organization. And Stern served in various offices in suffrage organizations. The other reason I've included them is because both served as links to women's clubs that were not solely devoted to suffrage. So they were that link to try to bring more women in. McWhirter was heavily involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, even before she was a suffragist. And Stern was heavily involved at the local and the state level with the Council of Jewish Women. Stern was also an officer in the Federation of Women's Clubs for many years, that statewide group that trained many suffragists. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? And excuse me again while I have something to drink. Okay, these two photos are taken from the Indianapolis News. November 2nd, 1920 was the day that women could vote. And so I thought that might be a nice thing to put here. What you're seeing here is on the left, a group of women lined up at the 5th Ward in Indianapolis on Indiana Avenue, just down the street from the Madam Walker Theater. If you're familiar with Indianapolis, it's the place where there's now a strip mall with a lot of restaurants. It's in that location. The other photo is from the south side of Indianapolis. And you can see there's a child that a mother took to the poll with her. Okay, now that I've explained those, let's see what happened in 1920. And I'll be brief because I know some people might have questions. Some states did not open voter registration so that women could vote in 1920. So in some states, women did not vote in November 1920. If you don't open the registration, they can't register, they can't vote. So for example, if we look at Georgia, Georgia did not open up their voter registration, so women did not vote. In states that suppressed voting by Black men, Black women's votes were also suppressed. In some states, on the other hand, women have been voting for a very long time. So for example, if we look at Colorado, all women, white and Black, had been voting in Colorado since the passage of their suffrage amendment in the 1890s. So across the US, the point is, voting regulations, registration decided if women would or would not vote on November 2nd, 1920. Also remember that Native American women could not vote until 1924, with some exceptions that meant they would not vote until either the 1950s or the 1960s. Women of Chinese ancestry could not vote until 1943 because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So when we say women could vote, we have to remember that there are some limitations there. I'm often asked if women expected there to be trouble at the polling places. Polling places had a reputation of being very rough and tumble. So for example, in Indianapolis in 1914, there were a lot of problems on voting day, and suffragists got involved in that. Dr. Keller and Luella McWhirter were handing out suffrage pamphlets at the polling place, encouraging men to think about giving women the vote. And they were told by the police that they were causing a disturbance and that they had to leave or they would be arrested. And so they did. Also in 1914, in African American wards in Indianapolis, the Democrats were so afraid of losing, and they knew that the majority of African Americans would vote Republican. The Democrats were so afraid of losing the election that Black registrations were challenged or thrown out. Black men were timed while trying to vote and told you have a moment, you have a minute, get in, do your thing, get out, which makes people nervous. And police were stationed outside polling places as a sign for those who were deemed ineligible not to cause any trouble when they were kicked out of the polling place. The situation was so bad in 1914 that the politicians behind the harassment of voters were charged with a conspiracy to prevent voting, but were found not guilty in 1918. Again, if somebody's looking for a wonderful research project, I would go for that. Note, though, that 1914 is at the beginning of the creation of Black women's suffrage clubs. The title in my book is We Must Be Fearless, and I think it applies to all suffragists, but especially in this case. They knew there were some problems, the Black suffragists did at the polls, at least in Indianapolis, but they persisted. And there's no evidence that what happened in 1914 led them to question their actions to support suffrage, and newspapers don't report the same level of harassment of any voter after 1914. In a recent book, Christina Walbrecht and Kevin Corder stated that where voter registration was easy and contests were competitive, women turned out to vote in large numbers in 1920, and this is true for Indiana. Unfortunately, official voting records for 1920 are difficult to find. Everybody go to your local courthouse and see what you can find. The state archives has a limited number of records. Fortunately, we have digitized newspapers that'll fill in the gaps. Two newspapers in particular, the Indianapolis News and the Indianapolis Star, reported from locations throughout the state, so we get this snapshot of what was going on. Registration in 1920 was easy. September 4 and October 4th were set aside for registration. Registration forms could be picked up at your local drugstore, filled out, and then turned at your precinct on one of those 2 days. If you could not go to the location yourself, two of your neighbors had to swear on the form that you were who you said you were, or you got a notary public to come in and verify that you were who you said you were. And then after that, you could get your neighbors to take the completed registration form to the precinct office for you. Registration sites were open from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. to give everybody time to get there. Everyone was encouraged to register on the first day so that the precincts would have time to bring in more voting machines or paper ballots, depending on the numbers. Women were reminded to register using their given names and not their husband's name, so Mary Smith, not Mrs. John Smith, and also to be sure to complete their age on the form. The Indianapolis Star even opened a phone bank so that if you didn't know where you were supposed to go to register, they could find out and tell you. So registering to vote was actually a fairly easy thing in 1920. Women registered in large numbers that first day, and in some precincts, more women than men registered. In many precincts, over half of the eligible voters, both men and women, registered on that first day. And sometimes they arrived at registration sites as a family unit so they could all register and participate in this historic day together. Women who came by themselves or with friends registered early in the day, and this will be true with voting. It seems women get out before noon. Sometimes women were lined up at the office before it opened so they could be the first ones to register. Suffragists spent the day in their cars taking anyone who needed a lift to the registration site. Many women in their 80s and 90s were the first to register. One 95-year-old woman announced that she hoped she didn't die before the November election. In Indianapolis, one woman stated that she wanted to vote because she wanted to nullify her husband's vote. In Richmond, Indiana, a woman who was a former slave and who did not know her age, she had no way to know, was allowed to register to vote in Richmond. And I don't know if she actually did then go ahead and vote a few months later. Officials in Evansville expected that by the end of the first day of registration, more Black women than Black men would be registered to vote. Registration offices were overwhelmed with new voters, and this was true in cities and small towns and in more rural areas. Between the first day of registration and the second day, political parties distributed even more registration forms at sites throughout the state. The second day, October 4th, showed no easing of voter registrations. Women again registered early in the day, and by the time registration was completed, again, almost as many women as men had registered to vote, with some precincts reporting almost 100% of eligible voters had actually registered. Some precincts in Miami County closed early because all of the people that they thought were eligible voters had already registered. In Marion County, about 170,000 men and women had registered to vote, and of that group, about half were women. The 1920 election was a big one. All of these new voters and precincts wanted to be prepared for the onslaught of what was to come. Note that there's very much a sense of wanting to be sure that women could vote and that registration was made as easy as possible. It appears that Indiana political parties wanted women to vote because Indiana was known for very close contest. And they did what they did to encourage these new voters to vote for their party. Then on November 2nd, as you see here, in spite of cold weather and in some places wet weather, which would include Bloomington, I believe, women made an early morning appearance at the polls across the state, and most women had voted before noon. In Marion County, it was estimated that less than 5,000 of the 76,000 women who registered to vote did not vote, which is really good. Nearly 100% of the women who registered in Warsaw and South Bend actually voted. Women arrived with their children in their arms and took them into the voting booth with them. And in Fort Wayne, that was challenged as a voter violation because you weren't supposed to have another person in the voting booth for you. And I have no idea exactly what the outcome of that was. My assumption is the person who challenged was told to just forget it. At other polling places, women who brought their children to the polls just simply handed them off to poll workers while they went to vote. Voting schools have been set up across the state, and women were very comfortable with going in and filling out ballots and machines. Marion County reported heavy turnout of Black men and women at the polls in Indianapolis. In South Bend, one poll official challenged all Black voters' registrations and prevented voting until the sheriff showed up. And then once the sheriff arrived, suddenly it was discovered that the registrations were indeed valid and voting took place. As I mentioned earlier, both parties seem anxious to garner new voters, and the Indianapolis Times stated that Black women in particular led to the large number of Republican votes in Marion County. Although the work is just beginning, and I've probably went way over my time by talking about this, I did want to talk about what's going on with the vote in 1920. That's something that needs just an enormous amount of research. 69 years of hard work led to what must have been a day of mixed emotions when they voted on November 2nd, 1920. Hoosier suffragist Ida Husted Harper summed up the day stating, "For the first time in all history, the members of the U.S. Congress in their deliberations on all questions will have to take into account the opinions of women. And when their minds revert to their cherished constituents, they will have a vision of women sharing the seats of the mighty."
Wonderful. Thank you, Anita. Wow. What amazing glimpses into Hoosier history there. And Some of the stories were a bit surprising and some of them were what we would hope for, right? So thank you so much. Your research is extraordinary, and it opens up a lot for us to think about, especially here in the good old Hoosier states. So thank you. So we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. So those of you who are viewing on Facebook Live, if you just wanted to type up your question there and post it, they will make it our way. So just wanted to let people know that. We do have some time for Q&A at this point. Of course, I have a few in my pocket for you. So I'd like to start with a question that was given to me from a student. There was a number of students this summer who did a book club on Anita's book, and I'll just show you the cover of it. Many of you have seen it before already. So it's a wonderful book, and they were going on about how much they enjoyed the reading and loved the inspiration and being able to talk about it amongst themselves. So one of the PACE students who was in this book club asked a question, and her question is what inspired you to write We Must Be Fearless, and what was your favorite part of the research and the writing process?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. I've actually been looking into this since the year 2000. When there was a huge celebration at the Indiana Historical Society, and they published a book called The State of Indiana History, with chapters devoted to different segments of Indiana. And I luckily was asked to write the chapter on women. And I realized at that point that we didn't have a lot of information out there about women getting the vote and suffrage. And in spite of my teaching schedule, which was pretty heavy, I started gathering little information here or there, but I really just kept hoping that somebody else would write this, to be honest. I thought, I just don't have the time. And then if you look at the acknowledgments of the book, I do mention that there was a women's march in Indianapolis a few years ago, and my daughter-in-law attended. And when I found out she was going, the thing that went through my head was, well, that's not the first time women have marched in Indianapolis. Don't you all know what happened in 1913? And of course, no one had. No one knew, because nobody had really written about that yet. So I thought, I'm going to write that book. It's time. What was the other part of the question?
What was your favorite part about the research or the writing?
Wow. Well, I got, as my former TA used to say, all the feels when I went into Grace Julian Clark's collection the first time and saw letters from Susan B. Anthony to Grace Julian Clark. Very, very much, I know you, you know me, we're familiar with each other. I don't know if they were friends, but they were at least very comfortable in their writing. And it really brought home to me that moment that, Indiana women were very much involved with the national movement. They knew everybody, and that just, that was one of those aha moments where you think, Indiana really is important. As a native Hoosier, sometimes we forget that we are important. And it's just not something that is ingrained into our culture, I'm afraid. And so it was really nice to see that.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have a couple of questions that came in from Don Johnson. The question is this may be on your research, but do you know whether early feminists in Indiana worked for the vote, such as Frances Wright from the Utopian New Harmony Society?
Yes, she was I did not cover her at all because I was trying to keep it like to a reasonable length. But yes, she was very interested, as was, of course, Richard Owen from the New Harmony settlement as well. It's a funny story. He worked really hard to get women's property laws changed in the 1850-1851 state constitution. And because he really thought women should be able to control their property. And although he didn't accomplish the task, women still gave him an engraved silver tea set for at least trying, which to me shows that how much they wanted that and how grateful they were that anyone took notice. Mm-hmm. Right. But otherwise on Fanny Wright, I don't know.
Okay, great. And from Lori Burns McRobbie, she asks, is there information on party affiliation with respect to voting in 1920?
Yes. I'm glad she asked that. One of the surprises I found in my research is I got to know these women and how they all worked together, and they were friends and they saw each other constantly. But then as we got closer to the 1920 election, suddenly they split into Republicans and Democrats. They go their separate ways. And they've spent all this time speaking around the state promoting women's suffrage, but now they're speaking around the state promoting their political party. And there seems to be no rhyme or reason really why they chose their party except for the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a really contentious issue. And you'll see, for example, like Grace Julian Clark, whose father, of course, was the radical Republican George Julian, suddenly joined the Democratic Party. That's who she feels closest to because of their stand on the League of Nations. And you'll see Dr. Keller go the opposite direction. But they did, and then you have some people screaming in the background, some suffragists saying, don't join a party, we owe them nothing. Don't work for a party. We would have had the vote a long time ago if they really wanted you around, so don't do that. But women did, and of course Mary Garrett Hay was the original chair of the National Republicans Women's Committee. So it didn't take them long to get involved in the parties.
Okay. I'm amazed at how many different stages along the way historically there's this sort of unification for a cause, and then there's these splits, and then there's these divisions, and it makes me curious. It would be interesting research to go down each of those paths, right, where the splits went and how it contributed to or inhibited the cause.
And it also shows, I mean, one of the things I've been fascinated with is a lot of these women did not actually like each other very well on a personal basis, it seems. Gougar and Sewall, no, they did not get along at all. And some other women as well, but yet they believed enough in the cause that they were able to put that aside. You know, personalities, let's not get into that. Let's continue forward and keep working for what we want. And I really admire them for that. That must have been difficult, but they did it.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So another question, they keep rolling on in.
Yay.
Thank you for being out there posting. So this one is from Megan Hutchison. What do you think was appealing about the Republican Party at that time for African American women?
At this time, Indiana's history is really interesting. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And so it was just a tradition, a custom, a long-standing, what do I want to say, goal in the African-American community to vote Republican. There was a sense, you know, the Republican Party is our party. And I think it's really interesting that Frances Berry Costin in one of her newspaper articles is saying, now wait a minute, don't just automatically vote the way you always have. Stop, look at the man, see if you think you can believe that he will deliver, and then vote. And I think it's really interesting that that's a newspaper article not aimed just at women, but men and women. The other thing that gets really interesting, we don't have time for here though, is after the 1920 election, you will see that African Americans in Indiana start to move in the 24 election to the Democratic Party.
Okay.
Because after 1920, then you have the Republican Party and the Klan get involved with each other. And so what happens in 24, at least according to the newspapers, is that African American men and women who had been voting Republican start to split their tickets, and they'll vote Democratic in the state elections, but they'll still vote Republican at the national level.
Interesting.
So originally it was just, that's what you do, you vote Republican, but then there's, I don't know if it's we would call it a rising political awareness, but that, hey, that Republican Party is doing things that we don't like, so we need to shift.
Okay, interesting. Well, and one of the next questions has to do with the media and this sort of difference between the local and the national level. So it's a great segue. This one's from Regina Moore, and she asks, what was the coverage like in the local Indiana newspapers in regards to the national suffrage scene? And then there's a part 2 to it. Would they get immediate information and publish stories on, say, Harry Burns's vote or the signing of the ratification document?
You would in the Indianapolis newspapers. The Indianapolis newspapers did an excellent job of covering national suffrage. So it's in there, and they started this way back. The Indianapolis newspapers were really very high quality at the beginning of the 20th century. The local newspapers, it's really spotty. Sometimes it's there, and sometimes the local isn't even there, even though we know things were going on. But most newspapers at the beginning of the 20th century, at least on their front page, would cover a few national things going on. And suffrage does pop up, especially as we get closer to 20. As it gets closer to looking like this is really going to happen, then you'll see it more.
Which perhaps helped perpetuate it to get the attention it needed.
Well, and it's interesting. One of the Indianapolis papers, and I can't remember which, polled women in August and said, do you think you want the vote? And women were like, well, maybe. But then after ratification, they did another poll. And because it was now possible, women were saying, well, yeah, I'm going to vote. So that barrier, that ratification, once that was done, they're like, yeah, I'll vote.
Well, that's great.
I think so too.
Seems like it brought a real cultural shift, a cultural awareness to.
I think it really did. I don't know if they were just saying, oh, it's not gonna happen. I'm not gonna get my hopes up. So no, of course I don't want to vote. I don't know. I do that sometimes. I'll think, oh no, I don't want that when I really do, hoping I don't jinx it. But maybe that was the case.
Right. So one of the things I was struck by in listening to you and, recognizing how you did some of your research for your book. I mean, you obviously took a lot of angles at the research that you did, it's really makes for a read that's very well-rounded and so thorough. So thank you for all those hours and years of work.
Thank you.
So I was curious, when you had mentioned some of the, in particular about the Black suffragist stories, trying to find those stories and bring them to light and to articulate them, you'd mentioned that you had talked to some of their family members.
Yes.
And so I was curious about that process. What was it like as a researcher to sort of track down the families? And then also, what was your experience like in talking to them?
I'll never forget doing that part of the book, I don't think. Most of it's, well, with Carrie Barnes Ross, it hit me when I was reading that the first suffrage meeting was at Madam Walker's home, that Madam Walker's, and forgive me, Amelia, if I forget this, great-granddaughter had published a book and was still in contact, is in contact with the Indiana Historical Society on a regular basis. So I said, would you please introduce me? How about an electronic introduction? And so I got in touch with her and I said, is there any chance that, you have any contact or know what happened to the Ross family? And she said, oh yes, let me give you Susan's phone number, which was Carrie's granddaughter, which was fantastic. So she introduced us electronically, and then I had a really nice phone conversation with Susan Ross. She sent me that photo, and what's really great about that photo is it's part of a very large, fancy photo album like they used to make a long time ago, where that oval frame around Carrie Barnes Ross is part of the photo album, and then you stick the photo in. Well, on that page, on one side is Carrie Barnes Ross, and on the other side is a photo of Madam Walker.
Oh, wow.
Which was really neat. And then as I found out more information, I've remained in contact with the Ross family, and they were just thrilled that Carrie's picture has been all over. With Frances Berry Costin's great-granddaughter, I got on Twitter this year, and I was tweeting about something and had her name, and all of a sudden pops up, hey, I'm her great-granddaughter. Can we get in touch? And I said, oh, wow. Yes, yes, please. And there is a much larger story behind Frances Berry Costin that needs to be told, and the things that she and her children did. But it was so nice to be able to talk to family members, and I hope, by doing things like this, family members of other suffragists might get in touch.
Great.
So we can fill out the picture a little more.
Indeed. Lots of more avenues for rich research, it sounds like, with these stories.
Oh, absolutely.
I hope you do get some good connections. So I'd like to just step back for a moment with the title of your book, We Must Be Fearless. I know when it came out in early March, I saw you at the Women in Work conference. You were one of the last people I saw before quarantine began. And
Yes.
and you know, that the term fearless, right? I mean, especially now in light of our COVID situation, there are a lot of fears that come up, and we are needing to be fearless in so many ways.
Yeah.
So I know in your book you refer to fearlessness in conjunction in many ways with the Black suffragists, but also for all of the suffragists in terms of the challenges that they faced and the depth of their Hoosier, you know, the Hoosier women's commitment to the cause. I like how you put it like that in the book. So could you say more about what, you know, using that term fearless and what it meant to you, and what struck you most in titling your book that?
Well, the phrase comes from Mabel Curry of Terre Haute when she was out giving a speech, drumming up support, and she was herself quite fearless, standing in the rain on a chair, addressing a crowd of 200. Not when she said this, but at a later time. She was not young when she did this. She was quite the fearless woman. So that's where that comes from. But I mean, if you think about it, they all had to be fearless. Think about how hard this was. Think about how hard it was to travel the state. Even with cars and with the interurbans, it's still not like the roads were very good. The roads were rutty, they were muddy. You could really only go in the summer, and then there was all the dust and dirt in the air. You had to stand in the rain to give a talk when you got there because you probably weren't going to go back again. I mean, it wasn't going to happen. So you had to do it when you did it. They also had to fight, quite frankly, fear of ridicule for standing up. And I don't know how they did the street meetings in downtown Indianapolis, where they stand in the car and they give speeches and everybody gathers around. You know, they were heckled. You know, there had to be some people there who were not happy with that. We have no records of anybody saying that their husband was against what they were doing, but I think it would be fair to say that probably some were not that happy. I actually, and this sounds probably a little hokey, but I actually find them very inspiring when I do my work, because I'm not the most comfortable talking like we are right now, quite frankly. But then I think, well, they did it. I mean, they did it. So if they can do it, I can do it. And what I also enjoy about this is men often describe them as persistent. Which is a word we hear associated with feminists today. They were persistent. And that always inspires me the same way. I'll be persistent too. I can finish this book. I will be persistent. And now I have to be persistent in getting back out in the COVID world and doing more research, because there's still a lot more that needs to be done, but we haven't been able to do it right now. But there is a lot of work that still needs to be done, especially at the local level, to see what happened, and to go back and mine the national archives, like the NASA archives, for example, and some of those records, to see what else we can possibly find.
Indeed. I think the timing for inspiration couldn't be more appropriate right now. So
absolutely,
that's great. That's great. Thank you. I find it inspiring too. So another question from the Student Book Club. Is there a moment in Indiana's history that you enjoyed learning about but didn't make it into the book?
Oh my. That's a good question. That didn't make it into the book. There's more on what. And I don't think I can do it because I don't think the sources are there, but I really wanted to spend more time on the Civil War and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. One thing that's always intrigued me is, why was there such a massive meeting in 1869? Why did hundreds of people show up in Indianapolis for this meeting? Why did former Union officers Indiana politicians, ministers from every denomination. Why did everyone show up? And I like studying the Civil War. So what exactly did that? So I think that's one area I'd like to go back and the newspapers covered this extensively. It's almost like a blow by blow, what happened, who said what, who got mad at what was the agitation. It's very thorough, but I don't know what drove them there, and I'd really like to know that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like another book in the making. That's great. So if anybody has any last questions, now would be the time to post on Facebook. We'll be wrapping up shortly. One of the things I think is interesting, a lot of people think of the American women's suffrage movement as a very kind of tunnel thing that happened, and there was the one cause and everybody was on board. And of course, you do a nice job of fleshing out a lot more of that complexity. And I think the suffrage centennial is offering a lot of thought about, there was a lot of other causes going on at the same time. You mentioned the abolitionists and the temperance movement, and how, and I know from some work I've done, the labor movement, so there's all of these different movements, and to be able to have suffrage take the main priority long enough and have enough traction to actually, be successful, I think says a lot about how committed people were to that cause while still doing other work. And
they exhaust me. I don't know how they did everything they did. It's just, how did you do that? I don't know.
Well, I keep thinking about the sort of association that many women have about being able to multitask. Right. I don't know if that's a stereotype or, I know in many of our lives that's the reality, right?
Right.
But yeah, I guess I just wondered what you thought about those overlapping causes and the ability for women to stay true to the path enough to get the 19th Amendment passed.
I kind of look at it, I think, from a different way, in that it's those other, right now I'm thinking of child labor laws and women's labor laws and vice regulation. I think it's the thought that they could do that drove them to suffrage. I think a lot of women started in these other ideas and then realized, like with the women's clubs, suffrage is what we have to do. If I want to achieve anything else, we must vote. So they figured out, and I don't know how, a way to do both. But I think for some women, suffrage was not the end goal because it was suffrage, but if I get the vote, then maybe I could change this situation over here, which is what I really care about the most.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Much easier to get there when you are an actual constituent.
Right. And politically speaking, it seems like getting the right to vote is kind of step number one. Right. And then there's like a spectrum, right? And then perhaps over on this end, we have women in political office, assuming public positions that are really important for decision making about important issues. So.
Right. Absolutely. I keep going back to Susan B. Anthony, and she started out in so many reform movements, and then she just became laser focused on the vote. And said, let's not worry about anything else. We can do so much more with everything else if we can just vote.
Okay. All right, one closing question, and then if you have any other closing thoughts, you can feel free to jump in. What can modern activism movements learn from the suffrage movement, both on a national and local level?
Be persistent, be fearless, and learn how to work with people that you may not like, that you have conflicts with on other issues, but that stay focused on that goal and work together to do that. I am continually impressed by how at the national level and at the state level, so many women were able to do that. Privately, they may not like each other, but publicly, we will work together and we will get this done. And I still think that's very important today.
Fantastic. Great. Any other closing thoughts before we sign off from your very inspiring, fearless and persistent keynote address?
Vote. Please vote. Make sure you're registered. Vote early. It's so much is going on right now. I think the suffragists would be very disappointed if you didn't vote.
Right. Yeah, they've worked very hard and sacrificed a lot to get us where we are. So
Absolutely.
all right. Well, Anita, can't thank you enough for being here. Such a delight to hear about your research and the Hoosier women, and just the stories were so rich, and very grateful for your participation today.
Well, thanks for asking me.
You're very welcome. And thank you so much to all of you out there in Facebook world for showing up, for watching, listening, asking really great questions. And yeah, just grateful that we could have this time together today. I'd like to close by acknowledging and thanking again for the outstanding contributions from the Arts and Humanities Council here at IU, the Office of the Provost and Executive Vice President, Themester 2020 Democracy, Department of History, and the Political and Civic Engagement Program, with some additional support from Department of Political Science and Gender Studies as well. So want to just also mention, we are having a series of events this week. We had a panel at noon today and a panel at noon on Monday with amazing undergraduate students. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, all of that is archived on the Facebook page for the Arts and Humanities Council. You can go back and watch those. We have another one coming up Friday at noon with participation from the Maurer School of Law, as well as Department of Political Science. And that one will be called, it's a noontime lunch panel, Power, Women's Political Participation in the United States and the World. And if you wanted to get more information about events this week or the semester, we've been busy planning for a while. There are many to choose from. go.iu.edu/1919A for 19th Amendment. So those are our closing thoughts for today. Anita, thank you again so much, and thank you for being tuned in. Wishing everybody a wonderful Women's Equality Day, and may we truly be in a more equitable place in our world as we move forward.